welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. She is the author of the book The Trouble with Jesus, no other than Miss Constance Hastings. Welcome to Book 101, Miss Constance. And can you please introduce more about yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Constance Hastings. I'm the author of The Trouble with Jesus. I come to this with my own experiences that reach all the way back to my time as an educator, as a mental health therapist, as working as an ordained deacon in the Methodist Church. And all of that converged and uh, um, you could say there was a call, a message that came through this book. And so I'm pleased to be here today to talk to you about it.
Miss Constance Hastings, thank you so much for sharing your book to the world. What is The Trouble with Jesus all about?
When people look at the title, many of them pause and want to think about, "Well, how is this? What is the trouble with Jesus?" And they sort of wonder if I have had my own problems, say, with God. And I usually reply to that, I've had no problems with God more so than anybody else usually does.
Yes.
In that, it is a book that is edgy in some ways. It's not offensive, but it contains a voice that is the voice of the doubter, the skeptic, towards the story of Jesus Christ. And that voice challenges the narration of his story and interrupts and asks questions, and you can just hear that there are things that just aren't readily accepted about the story of Jesus Christ. In the story of Jesus Christ, there's also the reality that when Jesus was born, he was born into trouble. Things were his birth narratives are not the story of a perfect birth. His parents, for the most part, were not married. His mother was pregnant, but she was with a man who was not the father of her child. It was a time of oppression. And just as the baby was soon to be born, the Romans came in and ordered that everybody participate in a census for the purposes of taxing. This taxing for the Romans was not to build the infrastructure and to make lives better for the people, but rather to celebrate themselves. So, in a very real way, they were being oppressed. They had to go to a town that was about 3 days' journey away from where they lived. The baby was born in a barn. Some people think it was actually a cave, some place that was meant for animals and livestock. And then, when it seemed like things might be settling down, these strangers from a foreign place come in and start asking for the king of the Jews. And they're in Jerusalem, and the king, Herod, hears about it and questions them and says, "Well, if you find this king that's supposed to be a baby, come tell me about it." They were fortunately warned not to do so after they did come present their gifts to the child and his family. And when Herod realized that he'd been duped, he sent in his soldiers to slaughter all the baby boys in the town of Bethlehem under the age of 2. This is the context in which Jesus was born, and he was born into trouble. Within his life and ministry, there also were things that in which it seemed like he wasn't doing things that would be one that would further his mission. One of the first chapters in the book is The Trouble with Jesus, was he chose losers. He surrounded himself with people that were not highly educated, did not have influence or power or very much money. And you would think that if you're going to start a movement, that you would find somebody who had this kind of surrounding around them that could promote you. And they couldn't do that. Another thing about his story is the trouble with Jesus was he valued women. At that time in that culture, women were certainly not valued. Basic three choices for a woman was to be a wife, a prostitute, or a slave. And for all practical purposes, in many cases, there was not much difference between the three. The trouble with Jesus was he refused to be a divine fixer. In other words, and we do this so much ourselves, is that people would come to him and want him to heal them, to feed them, to solve their problems. And whereas we do know in the ministry of Jesus Christ, he did help people, that wasn't his purpose. His purpose in doing that was to show that he had divine power that pointed to him as the Son of God. And there was conflict within himself over what these miracles that he was performing actually achieved. All of this converged in a political with religious leadership that wanted him gone, and they ultimately led to his death and crucifixion. So that was his life, a life of trouble. But that wasn't the end of his story. And this is troubling for people even today, is that the claim is that Jesus Christ overcame the worst kind of trouble, the trouble of death, and rose from the dead so that those who followed him, who believe on him now, may have that. In the book, whereas this is a familiar story in a lot of ways, there is choice that is given because God knows that if God is going to be loved, it must be done in such a way that people choose to love him. And so the choice to believe in Jesus is exactly that. So that's why the subtitle is Considerations Before You Walk Away.
So, Miss Constance, how does the book address doubts about Jesus and Christianity?
Uh, as I said, it does through this voice, and then the voice is edgy. Daniel, may I read from you the very beginning of the book where you can
Go
hear?
ahead.
Now, let's be clear about this. You can tell your story any way you see it, and I can jump in with my two-bit commentary when I want. But none of this believe it or you're going to burn crap. I'm only willing to listen because I believe Jesus' story might have had some things I like about it, but it's my choice what I do with it. I've been given other belief systems about the universe, how we got here, what it means to pass through this life. I guess, though, that I just think there's more. I'm willing to give Jesus the benefit of the doubt, and doubt is what I bring to this table. That voice, as I said, goes through and challenges the story of Jesus in many ways. And it is meant to be a reflection of what people bring to his story and how they struggle with it. To be honest, it's not an easy story to just accept. I found this particularly surprising when I submitted the book to an editor. And she was a confirmed skeptic herself. That's why I chose her to edit the book. And I told her, I said, I want you to let me know if this voice of doubt and skepticism that, as I said, questions and interrupts the narration is really true. And she agreed with that. But then she said, and this was particularly in the later part of the book, she said, there are some passages here that you have written as narration, but they sound as if they're coming from the voice of the skeptic. And Daniel, that's when I realized that what was coming through in those passages were my doubts and my questions as to the story. So that required a little bit of revision. But my point is that we all have this. We all have this tension, if you will, between believing, some would call it having faith, and these questions, these doubts, the things that we just look at and we go, I don't know. I really don't know. And some that tension sometimes can enter into a place of fear. And we look at our world and we say, what is going on here? And where is God? And that enters in, of course, to the story of Jesus and the people who knew him in his lifetime in the first century and where we all live today as well.
Certainly, indeed, Miss Constance. So let's talk about faith and doubt. What are the common reasons why people consider walking away from Jesus?
It is inherent within our own beings, the way we were born, the way we survive, is to want to um, have a measure of control over our lives. From the time a baby is born, comes out screaming because their world wrapped in a womb where all was provided has suddenly changed. And the only way in which that baby can affect change around him to get what he or she needs as far as food, as far as warmth, as far as love, is to protest that and to come out crying and demanding that love. It does, in a good home, that is effective. And when a child receives that love, a child has also understood that there is the possibility of growing and learning and negotiating that kind of love and control over one's life. As we grow in life, that's basically what we learn. How what we do affects the consequences of our lives. From a mental health perspective, I'll just say we're very much behavioralist. We respond to rewards, and some would call it punishment. We'll just call it negative consequences, and we allow that to direct and show how we control our lives. Now, take that characteristic that we have and apply it to God. When we come to God, we have to come to God with an admittance that we are not the ones in control, that God is the one in control. And to follow him is to allow God to have that place in our lives where we learn of a purpose that is beyond us. To allow that to happen is really hard. And it takes, as we've said, a measure of sacrifice. It takes a measure of commitment, and it takes that kind of acceptance of who God is and what God would be in our lives if we allow him. But not all are particularly able to do that as they go through their lives and don't want to give up that sense of control and who they are.
Certainly, Miss Constance. So, what would be your advice for those people out there that they have this shaking faith in Christianity?
A shaking faith, is that what you said?
Yes.
Um, it it is, there are things in our lives, and it's going to happen to everybody, like you say, where the ground underneath us shakes. And we come to a place where we have to realize that it is not of us, but it is of God. Let me explain to you one time in my own life when the world was shaking. I was working in a church, and we discovered that our financial secretary had embezzled over $100,000, and that's enough to shake a church. But there was a lot of tension and blaming among the congregation because this had happened. At the same time, I received word that my father had had a massive stroke and he would never walk or talk again. And so the support that I should have had for what was going on in my life personally had dissolved away. And I was pretty much left on my own on that. The time went on, and it became clear that he was not going to recover. And so my sister and I made the decision to follow the directives in his living will to remove nutrition and hydration and to let him go. Now, my father was not one who went to church. I mean, he went when I may be speaking, but other than that, he didn't go. And that I could count that a fewer times on both hands as far as how many times he actually went to church. He did not profess belief. But in that hospital room one day, I leaned over to talk to him, and I was wearing a cross. And this cross fell down in line of his vision. And I saw him look at it, and I knew that he understood what it was. About 10 days later, we got word from the nurses there that it wouldn't be much longer. And that night, I sat in the hospital room alone, just waiting and being there with him. But I realized that my prayers and my love were not going to change anything. And I felt that it was time to go. As I was moving to the door, one of the nurses came in, and she had explained to me that in this time, when people are beginning to fade away, they're having a last conversation with God. And that is what we talked about. As it was, I found from the conversation that her children went to the same um, Christian school that I had gone to as an elementary school student. And I told her about my own salvation experience and how the teachers there had taught me of God and of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross, and how, as a 7-year-old, on my knees, I had asked that Jesus forgive me because I felt so responsible for him having to die there on that cross. I tell people that years later, I read John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And when I read that, I read how Pilgrim, at the foot of the cross, in his repentance story, this great burden that he'd been carrying fell away. And that's the exact physical feeling that I had when I gave my life to Jesus. All of this is to say that life is not going to turn out as we want. And I was, as I said, in this church that was falling apart, where my father was and in his dying. And yet, God brought me to this place and gave to me someone to talk to. Later, I walked out of the hospital and I realized the last thing that my father heard from me was my salvation story. And I was given then such a confidence that God would receive him unto himself. And that's what I'm saying is, if you're hanging on to faith, if you're in that place of doubt and fear and that tension, and you just don't know what's going to happen, and you're afraid of what's coming, know that God is there too. And his way of meeting you there in that place is something that's more than you can ever ask for, even imagine. And yet it is the way in which God takes us in and cares for us and loves all those that we love as well.
Indeed, Miss Constance. So, what would be your short-term and long-term goals in writing?
Say that again, Daniel, please.
What would be your short-term and long-term goals in writing?
Short and long term goals. In writing this book, my short term goal is for maybe the person who is the believer and who wants to read this book to understand what doubts, fears that other people might have. But a long term goal would be that people, having read this book, would give it to someone for whom they're praying would receive Jesus Christ, and give it to them just after. I tell people, bloody your knees, be in prayer, be in deep relationship with that person, and and ask them, if you'll read this book, could we then have a conversation? As I
Yes.
said, the subtitle is Considerations Before You Walk Away. And in
Mm.
that place is where I believe the Holy Spirit can enter, and God will do what God will do in order for that person in their own lives, in their own time, can come to an acceptance of Jesus Christ.
Interesting, Miss Constance. So before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Food 101, in its fifth season, people. Fifth season with Chef Alessandro, one of his specialty chef in one of the five-star hotel in downtown Toronto. To please do listen to our latest episode. We are reading all over our letter senders all over the world. So please do listen. Food 101. So, Miss Constance, what is the overall message of the trouble with Jesus and how does it challenge readers?
To know the trouble with Jesus is to realize that Jesus knows our trouble. And as Jesus lived this life, he came to overcome it and to bring us that sense of not all is lost, that we can be that person who has that intimate relationship with him in this life and beyond this life as well.
Miss Constance Hastings, thank you so much for sharing your book to the world. And we are looking forward for more empowering books like this. So can you please invite our listeners to support the trouble with Jesus?
Yes, you can go, as I said, to my website, There's a lot of books there. You can find other ways of finding it. But I always do encourage people, why don't you go to your local bookstore and ask for it? And that'll help introduce the book to someone else as well.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Constance Hastings because if you support her, as I said, more empowering books about Jesus to come. So, Miss Constance, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
More to come, people. See you soon.